At first light, with the creek bed dry as old bone and 3 of Garrett Voss's riders walking their horses up the wagon road toward her, Pearl Hadley planted her boots in the dust, set the worn stock of an old Sharps rifle against her shoulder, and did not step aside. She had patched the spring box with her own 2 hands. She had pulled 4 half-wild horses back from the edge of dying. She had hauled water uphill in the worst heat the territory had seen in 20 years, bucket after bucket, until her palms cracked and bled and healed into something that did not crack anymore. She had balanced a ledger to the penny on a kitchen table by candlelight while the wind tried to tear the roof off above her. No man on a fast horse was going to ride onto this land and tell her it belonged to somebody else. Not that morning. Not while she could still lift a rifle and mean it. If a story about a woman the whole world had already counted out has taken hold of you, stay until the very last word, and somewhere along the way, leave the name of your town in the comments so we can all watch together just how far Pearl Hadley's story can travel. The summer of 1889 had come into the high country around Halloran's Crossing, Wyoming territory, like a thief who meant to stay. Rain had not fallen since the middle of May. The grass on the open range had gone the color of a faded coat. Cattle stood listless in the shade of the cottonwoods that lined the few creeks still running, and the creeks that were not still running had become long scars of pale cracked mud where the water used to be. In a country like that, a year-round spring was not a convenience. It was the whole difference between a place a man could live on and a place that would kill him slow. Everyone in the valley knew which ranches had water and which did not, the way other men knew who owed them money. The Crane Ranch had water. It had Cold Mary Spring, a deep, cold seep that bubbled up out of the rocks at the base of the North Ridge and ran clear and steady, no matter how high the sun climbed or how long the sky held back its rain. The man who owned that spring owned the future of half the valley, and the man who owned that spring had been gone for 2 years and 1 month. Elias Crane had ridden out of Halloran's Crossing in the spring of 1887 with 11 Greenbroke horses, a contract to deliver remounts to an army post 300 miles to the south, and a debt at the Cattleman's Bank that had been quietly choking his father's ranch since before his father died. He had meant to be gone 4 months. He had not meant for a wagon to shatter his leg outside a town he never afterward learned the name of, or for the long fever that followed, or for the second buyer who failed and the third who cheated him, or for the slow, careful work of earning a stake back from nothing in a country full of men who would gladly take it from you again. 4 months became a year. A year became 2. He wrote letters he was not sure arrived. He sent money he knew was not enough. And every single night, lying awake under strange roofs, he was certain of one thing, that when he finally came home, he would find a padlock on his gate and a notice nailed to his door, and he would have to stand in the dust of the place his father had built and watch some stranger carry it off piece by piece. He had prepared himself for that. He had told himself so, anyway, in the way that men tell themselves they are ready for the thing they cannot bear. He had not prepared himself for the sound of 3 rifles being cocked and a woman's voice carrying clear across the morning, telling Garrett Voss's foreman to turn his horse around. Elias had come up the back trail at dawn, gaunt and trail-worn, leading a single sorrel mare and expecting nothing. He had stopped his horse on the low ridge above his own home place and simply looked, because what lay below him did not match anything in his memory. The corral fence, which had been gray and sagging and half fallen the day he left, stood straight and tight. Every post sunk deep, every rail sound. The horses inside it were not the gaunt, ribby, half-feral animals he remembered. They were sleek and calm and watered, moving easy in the early light. There was a new shake roof on the barn. There was a garden where there had been only weeds, fenced against the deer, heavy with squash and beans and rows of dark green cabbages that had no earthly business growing in a drought year. And there was a young woman standing square in the wagon road below, broad-shouldered and full-figured in a faded blue dress, holding off 3 armed men as if she did it every Tuesday. "You're trespassing, Mr. Reyes," Pearl was saying, in a voice that did not rise. "You and your 2 friends. This is Crane land, and that's Crane water. And the next man who lays a hand on the spring box is going to spend a long while explaining to a doctor how he came to be shot." Dutch Reyes, Voss's foreman, leaned on his saddle horn and smiled the way men smile when they have been sent to do something ugly and have decided to enjoy it. Crane's been dead 2 years, fat girl. Everybody knows it. Mr. Voss is just protecting an abandoned claim before the territory does. Crane's not dead until the territory says he's dead, Pearl answered. And the abandonment papers your boss thinks he filed have a problem with the dates that I'd be glad to explain to a judge. Now turn around. Reyes's smile slipped. That was the part that interested Elias most, watching from the ridge, not the rifle, but the way the woman knew about the papers. The way she said the word dates like she had already read them. It was the sorrel mare that gave him away. She nickered at the smell of home, and every head in the road below turned up toward the ridge, and for one long suspended moment, the whole valley seemed to hold its breath. Then Pearl Hadley moved the rifle off Reyes and put it, very calmly, on the stranger coming down off the ridge because she did not yet know who he was, and she had learned in 5 hard months in that valley to trust no man until he had earned it. That's far enough, she called. Hands where I can see them. Elias raised both hands slow and kept his horse at a walk and felt something in his chest he had no name for. I'll do that, ma'am, he said. But I'd take it kindly if you'd point that somewhere besides the only man here who isn't working for Garrett Voss. And who would you be? I'd be Elias Crane, he said. And unless I'm dreaming, that'd be my barn behind you with a roof I never put on it. The silence that came down then was a different kind of silence. Dutch Reyes lost all interest in smiling. He gathered his reins, said something low to the 2 men beside him, and the 3 of them rode back down the wagon road toward Voss's range without another word. Because a dead man who turns out to be alive changes a great many calculations all at once. Pearl did not lower the rifle right away. She studied the gaunt, bearded, sun-cracked man on the tired horse, and she looked from his face to the brand on the sorrel's hip, and slowly she let the barrel drop. You're thinner than your photograph, she said. You've seen my photograph. It's on the mantel, she said. Next to your mother's Bible and your father's pocket watch, which still keeps good time, because I wind it. There's coffee on the stove. You look like a man who's been 3 days without a real meal. 4, Elias said after a moment. Near enough. And so it was that for the first time in 2 years and 1 month, Elias Crane stepped across the threshold of his own home and found it cleaner, warmer, and more alive than it had ever been in his father's day, with a stranger's bread rising under a cloth on the table and her ledger lying open beside it. They sat across from each other in the kitchen while the coffee cooled, and the truth came out in pieces, the way truth does between people who do not yet trust each other. Pearl Hadley had come to Halloran's Crossing the previous winter with $11, 1 carpetbag, and the firm intention of working. She had grown up in a boarding house kitchen in Nebraska, an orphan taken in for the labor she could provide, and she had learned young that a girl built like she was built would be measured by every man and most women before she ever opened her mouth, and found wanting before she ever lifted a finger. She had been a fine cook and a tireless worker, and it had never once been enough. A man back in Nebraska had courted her 1 whole winter for the suppers she set, and praised her hands and her sense and her steadiness, and had married a thin, pretty girl in the spring, and asked Pearl to bake the wedding cake. She had baked it. It had been the best cake in 3 counties. And then she had packed her carpetbag and gone west, because she had decided that if the world was going to look at her and see nothing of value, she would go somewhere far enough that she could build something the world would have to look at twice. In Halloran's Crossing, she had asked at every door. The hotel had no work for her. The 2 boarding houses had no work for her. The storekeeper looked her up and down and found no work for her either, though Pearl noticed he hired a thin, pretty girl from a passing family not a week later. She had $3 left when she walked out the wagon road toward a horse ranch folks said had been abandoned by a dead man, thinking only to ask for a night in the barn. What she found instead was a place dying for the want of one stubborn person to refuse to let it die. The spring box had silted and half choked. The horses were sick and hobble-galled and 3 days from the buzzards. There was a foreclosure warning from the cattleman's bank weighted down with a rock on the porch rail, and a stack of unpaid bills going back 1.5 years on the kitchen table, and not one living soul to answer any of it. So Pearl had stayed. She had not asked anyone's leave because there had been no one to ask. She cleared the spring box on her knees in cold water until her fingers went numb. She doctored the horses with what she knew and what she could read out of a veterinary book. She found water stained in the barn loft, and she lost one and saved the rest. She gentled them, slow and patient, and broke the 4 soundest to saddle and sold them quietly at the spring sale in the next county over. And with that money, she paid off the back taxes the county was about to seize the place for. She kept the bank from foreclosing by walking into Linus Pruitt's office, laying down a partial payment in cash, and informing him, calmly, that the ranch was occupied, improved, and being worked, and that the territory frowned on banks that foreclosed on improved and occupied land without proper notice. Pruitt had not liked it, but Pruitt had taken the money. And every dollar she earned, every dollar she spent, every horse she sold, every nail she bought, she had written down in a ledger in a small, careful hand, with the date beside it, because a woman who has been disbelieved her whole life learns early that the only argument no one can wave away is one written down in ink. "Why?" Elias asked her at last, and his voice was rough. "You didn't know me. You owed this place nothing. You could have taken what you wanted and ridden on, and no one would have ever known. Why did you stay and break your hands over a dead man's ranch?" Pearl was quiet, a long moment. She turned her coffee cup, a slow half-turn on the table, and she looked out the window at the corral and the horses and the green, impossible garden. And when she answered, she did not look at him. "Because every place I ever stood, somebody had already decided what I was good for before I got there," she said. "And it was always less than I was. Out here there was nobody to decide anything. There was just the work, and the work didn't care what I looked like. The work only cared whether I did it. I'd never in my life been anywhere that just let me be worth exactly what I could do." She finally met his eyes. "So I did it. All of it. And I stayed because for the first time in 24 years, I was building something that was mine, even when I knew it wasn't." Elias Crane looked at the calluses on her hands, plain even from across the table, and at the dried mud on her boots, and at the ledger lying open between them, with a year and a half of his family's survival written down in a stranger's patient ink. And he understood, slowly, that he had not come home to a thief. He had come home to the only reason there was a home left to come to. He did not have time to say so. That was the thing about the valley that summer. It did not leave a man much time for anything gentle. Garrett Voss came calling himself 2 days later, in a fine buggy with a fine matched team, dressed in a town suit on a ranch road, the way a man dresses when he wants you to remember which of you is wealthy. He was all warmth on the porch. He shook Elias's hand and called it a miracle that he was alive, and clucked over how thin he looked, and he never once looked directly at Pearl, the way a man does not look at a piece of furniture. He had heard, he said, that things had gone hard for the Crane place. He had heard there was a question of back taxes, of banknotes, of an abandonment filing that some overzealous clerk had started in Elias's long absence, a misunderstanding, surely, that a generous neighbor might help untangle. He would, he said, be willing to take the whole troubled property off Elias's hands at a fair price. More than fair. Enough for a tired man to start clean somewhere with rain. "That's kind of you, Garrett," Elias said. "What's your hurry?" Voss smiled. "No hurry at all. I just hate to see a good man buried under debt and paperwork. And these things have a way of becoming complicated when a woman with no claim has her name written all over a place." He let that sit. "People talk, Elias. A strange woman living alone on a dead man's land all those months. There's a kind of cloud over a thing like that. I can make the cloud go away." It was Pearl who answered, before Elias could. "The only cloud over this place," she said evenly, "is the abandonment claim you filed at the recorder's office in March, Mr. Voss. The one signed by 2 witnesses who swore the Crane Ranch sat empty and unworked. I imagine they swore it because you pay them. But I have the dated receipts for every horse sold and every tax paid out of this place since February. I have the affidavit of beneficial use I filed on Cold Mary Spring in April, the one that gives the working occupant of this land first right to the water. And I have a great many people in this valley who watered their thirsty stock at that spring this summer because I let them, while you charged your own neighbors $1 a head at your tank. Your claim says this land was abandoned. My ledger says it was saved. One of those is going to look very bad in front of a judge, and it is not going to be mine." Garrett Voss looked at her then. He looked at her for a long, cold, careful moment, the way a man looks at a snake he had taken for a stick. and then he tipped his hat and climbed back into his fine buggy and drove away. And Elias understood that the war he had ridden home, expecting to lose, had already been half won by the woman he had nearly shot in his own road. The next 3 weeks moved fast, the way a river moves fast just before it goes over rock. Voss did not give up. He was not the kind of man who gave up. The county recorder, a nervous small man named Hollis who owed Voss favors going back years, suddenly could not locate Pearl's water affidavit in the files. A note Elias had thought paid turned out, at Pruitt's bank, to have been quietly sold to Voss, who now held it and called it due. 2 riders cut the fence on the south line in the dark and ran off 6 of the broke horses. And though one of those horses came back lame, with a Voss pattern hobble still on her, no one could be made to swear who had done it. The cloud Garrett Voss had promised began, just as he had promised, to gather. But Pearl Hadley had not survived 24 years of being underestimated by learning to fold. She had survived it by keeping records. She had a second copy of the water affidavit, witnessed and dated, sewn into the lining of her carpetbag, because a woman who has been called a liar her whole life keeps 2 of everything. She had the lame mare with the Voss hobble, and she had the blacksmith who had shod that mare for the Crane place and could swear to the brand. She had the receipts, she had the ledger, and she had something Garrett Voss had never once thought to count. She had the goodwill of a dozen small ranching families up and down the valley who had watered their dying stock at her spring all summer for nothing, while the wealthy man, 6 miles off, had charged them by the head and reminded them, in 100 small ways, exactly who they owed. When the matter of the Crane Ranch finally came before the county land board in the town hall at Halloran's Crossing, on a hot bright morning in the first week of September, Garrett Voss came, expecting a quiet proceeding among gentlemen. He had Hollis the recorder in his pocket, and Pruitt the banker at his elbow, and a lawyer down from the territorial capital, and he had every reason to believe that a dead man newly returned and a fat orphan girl with no standing would be no match for any of it. Pearl Hadley walked in, carrying her ledger under her arm like a Bible. She let the lawyers talk first. She let Voss's man read the abandonment claim, with its sworn witnesses and its grave talk of a property left to ruin and a community's interest in seeing valuable water put to proper use. She let Pruitt clear his throat and speak gravely of debts and notes and the bank's reluctant duty. She let them build their whole house of paper, board by board, while she sat with her hands folded on the ledger, and Elias Crane sat beside her, and the room filled up at the back with quiet, weathered families who had not been invited and had come anyway. Then the chairman of the board asked, almost as a formality, whether the occupant of the property had anything to say. And Pearl Hadley stood up. She did not raise her voice. She had learned a long time ago that a woman who shouts is dismissed, and a woman who is very quiet and very certain is feared. This claim says the Crane Ranch sat abandoned and unworked from the spring of 1887 to this day, she said. I'd like to read you what I was doing while it was abandoned. And she opened the ledger and she read, February the 9th, cleared the spring box, 2 days labor. March the 3rd, dosed 7 head against fever, lost 1, saved 6. March the 11th, paid the county $61.40 in back taxes. Here is the county's own stamped receipt. April, broke 4 horses to saddle, sold them at the Carbon County sale for $140. Here are the bills of sale in the buyer's own hands. April the 19th, filed an affidavit of beneficial use on Cold Mary Spring, recorded by Mr. Fand. Hollis there, who today cannot seem to find it, though I have here the witnessed copy and 2 men in this room who watched me sign it. She set each paper down on the table as she named it. The pile grew. The room had gone very still. This claim says I have no standing, and that may be so, Pearl went on. I'm not a Crane. I came to this valley a stranger with $11 and was turned away from every honest door in this town because of how I am made. But standing or no standing, here is what I am. I am the person who kept that ranch alive while every clever, prosperous, well-spoken man in this valley looked at it dying and saw only a spring he wanted for himself. I am the person who let your stock drink for free, every one of you out there, all summer long. Mr. Voss filed a paper that says nobody was working this land. I have a 1.5 years of days that say he is a liar, and I will lay every single one of them out on this table until somebody in an office of authority is willing to look." She closed the ledger and laid her broad, scarred hand flat upon it. "Now," she said, "does any man in this room want to stand up and tell me whose hands built this back up out of the dirt? Because they are right here, and they are not Garrett Voss's." For a moment, nobody moved. Then, at the back of the room, an old rancher named Tom Becker stood up, hat in his fist, and said that his cattle would have died in July if that woman had not let him water them, and that he'd seen her working that ranch with his own eyes a dozen times since spring. And then the Okerlund family stood, all of them at once. And then the widow, Odell, stood, and then a half dozen others, until most of the back of the room was on its feet, weathered and silent and certain, every one of them, a witness Garrett Voss could not buy, because Pearl Hadley had already paid them in the only currency that outlasts money, which is the memory of a kindness done when it cost her something to do it. The land board did not take long after that. The abandonment claim was thrown out as fraudulent. Hollis, the recorder, sweating, suddenly remembered exactly where Pearl's water affidavit had been filed all along. The note Voss had bought up was found to have been mishandled by Pruitt's own bank in the buying and was set aside. And the chairman, looking at Garrett Voss over his spectacles, observed in a dry voice that the territory took a very poor view of men who swore out false claims on improved land, and that Mr. Voss might wish to consult his lawyer about what came next, because the matter was not finished, only the easy half of it was. Garrett Voss walked out of that town hall a smaller man than he had walked in. Within the year, the false claim charge would cost him a great deal of money and very nearly his standing, and Dutch Rays would leave his employ, and the valley that had once stepped carefully around Garrett Voss would learn that it did not have to. But that morning, all anyone saw was a wealthy man in a town suit walking out into the dust without his fine smile, while a fat orphan girl in a faded blue dress stood at the front of the room with her hand on a ledger and her whole worth, at last, written down in ink that no one could argue with. It was 3 weeks later, on a cold, clear morning with the first frost silvering the grass and the horses easy in the corral, that Elias Crane came and stood beside Pearl at the porch rail and could not, for a while, find his voice. "I've been trying to think how to say this so you'll believe I mean it," he said finally, "and I keep getting it wrong in my head." "Say it wrong then," Pearl said. "I'll sort it out." "I'm not asking you because I owe you," Elias said. "God knows I owe you everything, but that's not it, and you'd see straight through me if it were. I'm asking because in 2 years of riding alone through country full of clever liars, I never once met a single honest thing until I came home half dead and found you standing in my road, telling me the truth with a rifle in your hands. You've never once let me believe something that wasn't so, not about the ranch, not about Voss, not about myself." He stopped. He started again. "I love you plain, Pearl. Not the way it's in the songs. The way it is on this porch in the morning, with the coffee and the frost, and you next to me. That's the only kind I've got faith in." He reached into his coat. Pearl's jaw set hard, because she had had a man praise her hands once before and marry someone else, and she had sworn she would never again be surprised by a man holding something out to her. But what Elias Crane put on the porch rail was not a ring. It was a folded paper. He had thought about a ring and decided that Pearl Hadley was not a woman a man should startle with, a thing meant to be worn not before he'd asked whether she wanted to wear it. The paper was a deed amendment, drawn up 2 weeks before in the careful hand of a territorial lawyer that made Pearl Hadley not a hired hand, not a guest, not a stranger with no standing, but full and equal joint owner of the Crane Ranch and Cold Mary Spring, with her name on every line and her authority on every decision, independent of his, for the rest of her natural life. She read it. She read it twice. Then she looked at him. "I'd marry you, Elias Crane," she said, and her voice was not quite steady, which from Pearl was nearly weeping. "On one condition." "Name it." "My name stays on that deed," she said. "Whatever else changes, whatever happens, my name does not come off." "That," said Elias Crane, "is exactly what the paper's for." She put her broad, scarred hand flat against his chest, the way she tested a fence post to see whether it would hold. It held. "Yes," she said, "just that, nothing extra." And he put his hand over hers and held it there. They were married in the second week of October. in the little white church at Halloran's crossing, and the whole valley came the Beckers, and the Okerlunds, and the widow Odell, and the blacksmith, and a dozen families besides, the same weathered people who had stood up for her in the town hall, every one of them watering at her spring still, and glad of it. Pearl wore a new dress of soft gray wool that fit her exactly as she was made, with no apology in a single seam of it, and Elias stood at the front in his father's old coat and could not stop smiling. And the storekeeper, who had once looked Pearl up and down and found no work for her, sat in a back pew and clapped along with everyone else, because in a small valley, a man learns, sooner or later, who is worth knowing. They danced afterward in the church hall to a fiddle and a banjo, and Pearl Hadley, who had baked another woman's wedding cake once and then walked 1,000 miles west, ate the first slice of her own. A year on, the rains came back to the high country, and Cold Mary Spring ran clear and cold as it always had, and the Crane Ranch, both their names on every line of the deed, carried more horses than it had in either of their father's time. There was a baby coming by spring, and a new room built onto the house to hold it, and on the cold, bright mornings, Elias and Pearl took their coffee out to the porch rail, where she had once stood with a rifle pointed at a stranger, and they watched the horses move easy through the frost, and neither of them said much, because there was no longer anything that needed proving. She had not simply saved a ranch. She had walked into the one corner of the world that did not yet know to count her out, and she had built, board by board and fence post by fence post and morning by morning, the exact life she had long ago stopped letting herself want. And no man, not Garrett Voss, not the banker, not every door that had ever been shut in her face, would ever take it from her again. Worth was never something Pearl waited to be handed. She wrote it down, day by day, in calluses, and kept receipts and small kindnesses given when they cost her something. You carry that same ledger. Keep showing up, keep doing the honest work, keep being good to the folks around you, and one ordinary morning, you'll look up and find you've quietly built a life no one can take from you. Please note, this story was created and fictionalized by AI to bring you a little entertainment, while passing along a warm and hopeful lesson worth carrying into your own day.